This is a beautiful night with Professor R.K. Chatterjee, the best-selling author of Great Indian Railways and, of course, Adam's Bridge. Professor Chatterjee, how's everything there?
Dr. Magan, what a wonderful a pleasure to see you again, and I hope you're doing well. And we are really excited to see the warm reception of our first three episodes. It seems our community is growing, and it's a wonderful platform for us to talk about more interesting stories. So I'm sure you have plenty of questions today.
For sure, I have so many questions. Today is Railway Day, and you can say hashtag railway. Railways are so important in the lives of Indian people, not just Indian people, but many people all across the globe. So, Professor Chatterjee, essentially, the railway symbology for you is very striking. I'll have to go straight to the necessary things here. It's interesting how ghosts and railways are kind of in the same zone. How do you how do you manage to explain to our viewers, this positioning of the ghost and the railway all together on the same page?
Well, thank you for leaving no room for imagination. I think you've plunged into what you wanted to ask, and you've plunged into a highly counterintuitive analogy: railways and ghosts. Whatever connects them. Well, nothing, it would seem. But in the Indian context, and certainly in any colonial context, I would like to argue, it is very likely that the railways, or if not the railways, some heavy public industry, public institution like the railways, definitely connects, the administrative orders of, a colony, of a colonial regime, and people's present day
Mm-hmm.
lives through the vestibule of ghosts. And naturally, when I use the word ghosts here and the vestibules of ghosts, as it were, I'm talking about ghosts in metaphorical sense, because ghosts here are in notion also derived from what would what would be called the Marxist ghosts or the Marxist specters in somebody like Jacques Derrida, for example, who writes in Specters of Marx about surplus value and specters in the same way. So when we talk about ghosts in relation to the railways, we certainly mean a lot of nostalgia, a lot of the kind of memories of aristocratic labor and memories of hard labor, even sometimes unpaid labor by the masses of a colony such as India back in the 19th century when the railway tracks were being laid down. And lots of mishaps, lots of unplanned incidents occurred because the railways are a tremendously heavy duty industry, and to bring railway tracks and the placement of railroads and the sheer baggage of labor and the sheer baggage of happening to wait for your wages, all this takes a huge toll on the people working in that industry. So there have been lots of unforeseen deaths during the construction of railroads in India in the 19th century. There have been famines, so people
Mm-hmm.
have starved to death as well. And these famines were in large parts owing to the railways, because the colonial administration was very keen on laying down railway tracks, but not creating enough irrigation canals. So people who were dying of droughts kept dying in larger multitudes. And then there are railway accidents, and then there are
Ah.
stories of railway sahibs, that is, the colonial lords, the colonial administrators, the bureaucrats, and the babus, the middlemen, the Indian go-betweens between the British and the Indian natives. So those people have lived and they have died by the railway tracks. So all this mishmash of memories, on the one hand, aristocracy, colonialism, imperialism, starvation on the other, the fight for your human rights, and
Yeah.
so on. These contested memories come together in the railway stations of India, and that creates an amazing corpus of very convoluted, very complex memories which cannot be articulated in the normal language that you and I are talking for example, in. So they have to resort, the writers, the historians have then to resort to the language of the ghosts or the medium of the ghosts or the specters, as Derrida would call it.
That's a very good response, Professor Chatterjee. Let me remind our viewers today that tonight we are going back in time because, in one of your articles, you mentioned that there's time in the train, and we are capitalizing on Ranjan Kundu, and of course, written by Satyajit Ray. So, this is India's filmmaker. Please take us to that scene in the first class compartment, which is very phenomenal a title. What this is, who's inside, and of course why it's happening. All these spectral events in the first class compartment.
Okay, so I think you are referring to my article on Satyajit Ray and Indian Railways and ghosts. And in my article and in my other peer-reviewed research and my book, The Purveyors of Destiny, later published as The Great Indian Railways, I write about Satyajit Ray among plenty of other Indian authors, including R.K.Narayan and Ruskin
Yeah.
Bond. And I say that these authors have kept alive the Kiplingesque tradition, the tradition that was derived from Rudyard Kipling, who was writing
Yes.
in the 19th century. And Rudyard Kipling was also, for lack of a better word, the inventor of what can be called a railway literature. Now, railway literature was nothing but, as the phrase goes, it was a genre of literature which had railways as their settings, and they were published, or at least at any rate sold at railway stations, and they were read by railway passengers. In fact, A.H. Wheeler and Company, which was a railway bookseller, later became a publisher, and they started publishing Kipling's stories since 1878. Anyhow, we'll digress. But one of Kipling's very interesting stories, my own true ghost story, was set in a railway dark bungalow, and eventually in the story, I will not give any spoilers. Eventually, in the story, it is found out that the story does not have an actual ghost, but it's about ghostly experiences by a Briton, by uh, maybe the entire British colonial machinery, as it were. So it is allegorical. The Kiplingesque aesthetic, therefore, can at least feed three or four characteristics. There's an eerie quality to the stories, especially when we are talking about ghosts and mysterious circumstances. There are dark bungalows. There are railway stations, railway carriages, passengers who don't know where they are going. They seem to be lost a
Yeah.
bit, and they are generally representatives of the colonial regime. Uh, so these aspects play, they play heavily in the stories by R.K. Narayan, Ruskin Bond, and Satyajit Ray. Ruskin Bond, very interesting. He was an Anglo-Indian author. He has this amazing maxim which he keeps on telling journalists, that when I run out of people, I invent ghosts. And some of that
Okay.
seems to have fed into Satyajit Ray's imagination as well. Although Satyajit Ray is no longer with us, he left us in the early I think 1990s. But so he's far senior to Ruskin Bond. But Satyajit Ray himself has had a very illustrious genealogy. He hails from a family of eminent writers, cartoonists, publishers, and he was himself a very, very illustrious filmmaker. He wrote The First Class Compartment in 1982 in Bengali, in the Bangla language, and it was published in a magazine called the Sandesh, which means message, which was founded by his own father. So it was his family magazine. And the story First Class Compartment is set in 1970. It is about a character who you have named Ranjan Kundu. And Ranjan Kundu or Ranjan Babu. Babu is an honorific, which means Messieurs or Mr. So Ranjan Babu is traveling from Madhya Pradesh in central India back to Calcutta in West Bengal, where he hails from. But in his mind, he hails from Britain because he is so Anglophilic and Anglophonic. And even in 1970, this is 23 years after India's independence. So he is not very well liked among his friends because of his, his huge, tremendous nostalgia for colonial
Mm-hmm.
rule, and he believes that India is not doing well at all in under the independent administration. Anyhow, his his almost pathological Anglophilia takes a huge toll on the railway. So while returning from
Mm-hmm.
central India to Calcutta on the Bombay Mail, he meets a ghost. He meets the ghost of no less than one Major Davenport from
Uh-huh.
1932. Apparently, Major Davenport had died in 1932, and this is a first class compartment. So it has got all the appendages of a wonderful cinematographic setting. It's got the blue light, it's got all the plush furniture, and Ranjan Kundu is reading a detective novel in the moonlight of the dark railway compartment, which is a first class compartment. And he's reminiscing about the colonial era. And he falls asleep. Just as he wakes up, he
Uh-huh.
finds the ghost of Major Davenport. And Ranjan Kundu is actually quite thrilled. He sees Major Davenport drinking, but Major Davenport refers to him by the N word.
Mm-hmm.
And this is slightly, ever so slightly alarming for Ranjan Kundu. But his Anglophilia is still very much alive. He's
Mm-hmm.
still hoping that Major Davenport would rise from his seat and embrace Ranjan Kundu and say, wow, I love you for keeping the British heritage and British pomposity alive. But none of that happens. Major Davenport keeps drinking and he insults Ranjan Kundu. And eventually, Kundu is terrified. And Ranjan Babu then just, he has to wait for the daybreak because,
Mm-hmm.
like every, a good citizen, he knows that ghosts do not uh, any longer linger in daylight. So he falls asleep. Ranjan Kundu falls insensate, and when he wakes up, he finds that the ghost is no longer there.
Okay.
10 years ago, when he discusses this incident with his friend Pulakesh Sarkar, who was on that night supposed to travel with Ranjan Kundu back to Calcutta,
Uh-huh.
Pulakesh Sarkar, Ranjan Kundu's friend, reveals to him, well, there was no ghost, it was I who was playing the ghost.
Okay.
And this shock factor leads to, maybe a kind of a therapeutic case in
Mm-hmm.
Ranjan Kundu's life, and he overcomes his Anglophilia, which was, almost bordering on pathology. So that is the story of First Class Compartment, and it tells us many things. So I think it addresses your question, at least in so much as saying, in so much as explaining what the specter means. A specter is a
Uh-huh.
surplus of nostalgia, of, on the one hand, utmost Anglophilia, utmost nostalgia for colonial rule, and on the other hand, the surplus of the bitterness, of the resentment that this nation, that India, and many other parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia feel for their colonial masters. Between these two contestations, we have the birth of the ghost.
That story, that narrative, it's just out of this world. Can you imagine a ghost choosing a first class compartment? Of all places on the train, the ghost, the specter, chose the first class compartment. Well, as you said, this wasn't really a ghost. It was somebody, a real human being, Kundu's friend, masquerading as the ghost. Professor Chatterjee, I said earlier that we are taking ourselves back in time, and that if there's anything, the writer, of course, the filmmaker, is so keen on the history of India, being the recipients of the, of the imperialistic stance of Britain. So along the way, we could talk about deconstruction and how this filmmaking arrived at an avenue where this sort of nostalgia can be reconstructed, reimagined, reinstituted, at least on the pages and in our consciousness as well. What do you think is the most important or the core element here in the deconstructive process?
Well, it is a very interesting question, Dr. Magan, and that just goes to show the kind of consciousness and the kind of, very deep awareness about Indian past that you have brought to the table. I think you're implying, you're hinting at the fact that Satyajit Ray was also the inventor of a character like Feluda. So, for the benefit of non-Indian audiences, Feluda is a Bengali character. He's spelled generally as Feluda.
Mm-hmm.
Felu Mittir, or Felu. I'm guessing might be some kind of a nickname of a Bengali name like Proful or whatever. So Felu
Mm-hmm.
Mittir is his full name, and Felu Da is an honorific. Da means elder brother,
Mm-hmm.
right? So Feluda is your Feluda, he's my Feluda, and he's everybody's Feluda. So he was also a character who lived, or who was written about in the beginning, in the 70s, late 60s, and so on, roughly around the same time that the First Class Compartment is set.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when I read the First Class Compartment nowadays, I actually also imagine Feluda. God knows why. I shouldn't necessarily, because Feluda is a different character. He does not have nostalgia for British rule. He does not have nostalgia for the colonial regime, but he's a Bengali, a good Bengali, and like every good Bengali, he is very well versed with colonial administrative knowledge. He has good
Mm-hmm.
knowledge of the railways. He has good knowledge of the postal system, and these characteristics also remind you of a renowned British character, Dr. Magan. We have discussed him. Can you guess who I'm talking about?
We had him in the first episode.
Yes, and that is Sherlock Holmes. So Felu Mittir is not any ordinary individual. Feluda is a detective, and
Uh-huh.
therefore, I think it's important that we look at Satyajit Ray in that light too. So your question is drawing us to look into Satyajit Ray not merely as an absolute critic of the British Empire, but somebody who's trying to become more conscious of
Yes.
what were the vicissitudes of imperial rule, and what kind of stains, what kind of imprints has that era left on the minds of people, and how to decolonize. So decolonize is not simply military or political, or even maybe spiritual decolonization, but in the process of decolonization itself, a lot of new kinds of colonial pathways are born, like in 1970 when the story is set. It is also the time when the Naxal revolution, it is emerging in West Bengal and central India, where Ranjan Kundu and his friend Pulakesh Sarkar visit during Durga Puja. So this is actually Durga Puja season, October, and it is around this time that they visit there 54 years ago in the fictitious world. And central India, Madhya Pradesh, is today still one of the hotbeds of the Naxal revolution in India. So the
Mm-hmm.
Naxal revolution is on its way out. But what the Naxal revolution was in 1969-70 when it emerged, it was essentially the poor peasants, the
Mm-hmm.
Adivasis, the aboriginals, um, congregating against the people who were rich, who were the landed class, the landed
Mm-hmm.
aristocracy. And India is very often criticized to have the caste system or the varna system, right? It is a chatur varnya system. There's a caste
Mm-hmm.
hierarchy in people's minds, although constitutionally it does not exist any longer. But interestingly, people from all castes, including the quote unquote, naturally, you would imagine the quote unquote underprivileged castes would play a very important role, but the quote unquote privileged castes also started, actively participating in the Naxal revolution, because it was a
Mm-hmm.
class war. It was a war of economics. It was a war of economic means and political means. So it was an armed struggle against the army and against the citizens of India. So
Mm-hmm.
in no way can I, in a sane mind, endorse that kind of guerrilla warfare. But at the same time, we have to feel consciously for why the Naxals took up arms, because they did not have practically anything to eat. And at that time, the administration in West Bengal was coming down very, very harshly on the citizenry. Anyhow,
Mm-hmm.
without digressing too much, so Dr. Magan, to answer your question, there are multiple kinds of specters. Even a post colonial administration can become a spectral administration for some people.
Exactly.
In 1970, when people do not have enough to eat, there is this character who's epitomizing who's idealizing, apotheosizing the British regime. So this is, I wouldn't say unforgivable, but it's simply absurd. Okay.
Hmm.
So this kind of a reality also needs representation. And Satyajit Ray is representing, on the one hand, Feluda, who's a very conscious individual. He does yoga, he teaches his nephew. He's a bachelor, and he harnesses all his energies and channelizes them into the intellectual realm, almost like a
Okay.
modern day sannyasi, modern day yogi. On the other hand, there's Ranjan Kundu, who's so much drawn by this, utmost lustful, attraction towards the British regime, that he can't see the plight of his own citizens.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's interesting again because his being Anglophilic was sort of antagonized by by his friends. But toward the end, of course, there is a succinct realization of what should have been. But I thought that everybody like Kundu has to go through that process, the rabbit hole mechanism. But more than this, I'd like to ask you because you sort of mentioned how Satyajit Ray never ever mentioned whether or not those who play the character of those fantastical vendors were also the cohorts of, the friend. Because you told me before that this was the element in the story that was not given clarification by the filmmaker, by the writer himself.
Absolutely. Yeah, please go ahead. That's fascinating.
Just to give our viewers a bit of an idea, I'm asking this question because this is the part of the short story that touches on food stuff. You see, there's this Muslim chai, and am I correct, Muslim or Islamic chai, and Arabic chai, and Indic chai. So, in terms of what you would buy at the train station, you are identified with who you are with what you drink. It's like what you drink is who you are. What you eat is what you are, something like that. How does this element in the short story factor in the deconstructive element in Satyajit Ray's creation?
Again, a very, very wonderful question, Dr. Magan. Just goes to show how well you've read and focused on the details of that short story. But so Dr. Magan's question is not merely about first class compartment. It talks about one various layers, complex layers of Indian
Mm-hmm.
history, particularly 19th century history, and is referring to, the question is referring to how the story itself is deconstructing itself. And this is a classic Derridian reading. Now, before Ranjan Kundu wakes up from that sleep that he had plunged into over that improving detective novel, and he wakes up, just to mention a tiny detail, in a station called Rourkela. So Rourkela is in
Mm-hmm.
Odisha, and the train will then go to Tatanagar or Jamshedpur. By the way, I'm right now sitting in Jamshedpur, and then the train will enter Calcutta. This is 1970, and this is Bombay Mail. And Bombay Mail back then is one of the fastest trains, if not the fastest train. And
Uh-huh.
this is before or during the introduction of Rajdhani, which then became the fastest train of India. Today it is Vande Bharat. Anyhow, so he wakes up in Rourkela and he hears what seems like quote unquote Hindu chai or Hindu tea. This is the cry of a vendor. No one for the last almost 40 years or 35 years plus, no one in India had uttered that cry. Practically after 1940, cries like Hindu chai and Muslim chai were no longer heard. Why? Because in 1942 there was a Quit India movement, and wide scale, massive scale national uprising, national integration happened between the communities living in India, not just Hindus and Muslims, but also Sikhs, Christians, Jews, Parsis, Anglo Indians even wanted an independent Indian nation that is away from British rule, British and also French and Portuguese rule, by the way. So, but why was Hindu chai and Muslim chai even heard on the railway platforms? Well, since 1860, mostly 1870, we have this practice in on Indian railway stations of segregating Hindu and Muslim pantries or tea stalls or food stalls. There are good reasons. Hindus and Muslims and various castes and various classes, even nowadays genders even, uh, want segregation. Let's face the facts, but not of the kind that we saw during the British regime. When I use the
Mm-hmm.
word segregation, I mean it in a very mild way. I do not
Mm-hmm.
mean it in an institutionalized way. I do not mean it, on a politicized level. I simply mean people would sometimes want to prefer their privacy. Whether or not
Mm.
that is right, it's a different debate. I do not endorse it on a large scale, because that creates tremendous tension between communities or groups of people, and that is exactly what happened. So the railways were used, on the one hand, to unite people, on the one hand to reduce distances, but on the
Mm-hmm.
other hand, in various quarters, the railways became this vehicle under the colonial administration to increase differences, to increase tensions between people, which is why the railways were the first targets of the nationalists, Indian nationalists in the 20th century.
I see.
Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi,
Yeah.
he sat on fasts on the railway stations ever so often. So the railways were used as this theater by the British to practice divide and rule between Indian communities. Now, for the last 40 years, nobody has uttered that cry on railway stations. How does Ranjan Kundu, who upon waking up at Rourkela hears this phantom cry of Hindu Chai, who
Mm-hmm.
was uttering this cry? Pulakesh Sarkar, his friend, was playing the role of Major Davenport, the ghost, as it
Yes.
were. But do voices also have ghosts?
Uh-huh.
Utterances of the past, voices of the past, or as the phrase goes, echoes of the past. So, Hindu chai or Muslim chai, the cries that Ranjan Kundu hears in Rourkela, these are the apparitions of the echoes of the past. In
Mm.
other words, to put it very crudely, maybe these were hallucinatory voices that were preparing
Oh.
the foundation for him to conjure the ghost, to receive the ghost. So the ghost is almost like an act of labor. It's a labor of love.
Yeah.
Because Ranjan Kundu loves the British regime so much, he is capable of conjuring the ghost. And that is why the ghost comes to him. That is why
Mm.
Pulakesh Sarkar plays the ghost in front of his friend.
That's how do I even describe it? It's just so intellectually concocted by Satyajit Ray. And when you uttered the word conjuring, it's like this person who is very Anglophilic is indeed hallucinating, and he is perhaps I would say he's bored by being Anglophilic because when he rested, when he was kind of tired already from everything that happened around him, he was summoned by his own subconscious, to be able to listen to these voices. And only then could he realize what was really happening along the way and what would eventually happen. And I thought that this friend of Kundu, who played or who masqueraded as the ghost, was doing a great favor to him, to make him realize what should be thought of as an Indian nation, a conglomerate of ethnicities, and more than that, a huge mass of land which is concerned with not just India, but of course the rest of the world. What do you think is that significant railway ideology that every culture out there has to say?
I think you said this, or you hinted at this towards the beginning of our conversation today, that the railways are repositories of time. They are chronotopes. They are slices of time away from time. They are heterotopias. I'm merging two concepts here. Chronotopes are a notion developed by Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian theorist, and
Uh-huh.
heterotopias were conceived of by Michel Foucault. So chronotopes are actually space time combined, and heterotopias are combinations of multiple spaces. So the
Mhm.
railways, whether inside the colonial context or outside the colonial context, they are conglomerations of divergent time zones. And that is
Mm.
why the railways are so amazingly conducive to ghost stories, whether or not a territory has had a colonial past. Which is why,
Mm.
what this leads me to say, that if if viewers find our conversation interesting today, then there are so many kinds of ghost stories in the Indian context and outside the Indian context pertaining to railways. So today we've discussed Satyajit Ray, and that too one just one story. But the railways are a huge enterprise, both industrially and creatively. So to answer your question, to go back to that, essentially the railways are merging multiple kinds of time zones at the same time as they're taking you away from your home or your
Yes.
destination. They are that interim, they are that, that middle ground, that middle passage. It's a vestibule which has no beginning and no end. I don't mean that literally, obviously. What I mean essentially is that it's this interim which takes you
Uh-huh.
into a rabbit hole, to use your phrase, Dr. Magan. And the railways have therefore been conceived of by multiple authors, by multiple cultures, as a home away from home. It's a home in transit. And
Yes.
particularly in a space like South Asia, where the geography is very large and the train journeys are also very long, you create very transitory, transient, to use the word from Albatross, ephemeral relations, but these relations are highly memorable. Okay, so memory is a very important factor which is going to link railway experiences from all cultures.
You're talking about the rabbit hole mechanism and the vestibule, and also you can say it's a toll booth. And this mechanism is very quintessential. Otherwise, there would not have been a sign of epiphany on the part of the character, for example, Kundu, who should understand what the new context is.
Hmm. The ghost can also be explained as a kind of an epiphany. In a manner of speaking, the ghost is also a negative epiphany of sorts, and the consequences or the entire ramifications of that are revealed to him 10 years later. And he thanks Pulakes Sarkar. So you're right in saying that Pulakes Sarkar was doing him a favor, because even in the economy of the story, Ranjan Kundu is eventually grateful to his friend for having acted as the ghost and having rewired his neural framework, and no longer was he an Anglophile. This story does not teach us to hate a culture, but it also
No, it
tells
doesn't. It
us
doesn't.
tells us not to have blind, a lustful love for cultures or groups of people, especially when they have ruled over you and have handed down a very flawed administration. Under those circumstances, it's a strict taboo, and it's very harmful for your own psychology.
Correct. And, he did his friend a favor. Collectively, we can say that this kind of amnesia, but, in relation to that, Professor Chatterjee, would you say that Kundu is having this sort of deliberate amnesia, you know, nourished by his own inclinations about what a real society should be?
Hmm. I don't think it's a deliberate amnesia, because it is also an outcome of the class inequities in India back in 1970.
Uh-huh.
As late as 1970, there are many British firms operating in India, and in the 70s, the Indian industry was nationalized, banks were nationalized, and so on. And again, this is not an endorsement of whole-scale nationalism, because these processes can be very cataclysmic on the economy sometimes. But at the same time, the presence of British culture had overstayed its welcome in India in 1970. And stories, so Ray is writing in 82, much after the nationalization, much after the decade of the emergency. So it is definitely a clear message that the amnesia that people had, it may have been deliberate or it may not have been deliberate, but clearly
Uh-huh.
it was a consequence of tremendous inequity that
Yes.
Indian society was divided in at that time. So I think we still haven't overcome. We still haven't come past the time when we would stop talking about ghosts. Ghosts are still very relevant, and it is still relevant to discuss
Very,
first class
very
compartment today
relevant.
in 21st century India.
How awesome. I mean, how dare these ghosts occupy the first class compartment and then transform our minds into this intellectual runway of information, moving on to the 21st century and telling our audiences that this is how things are discursivized and that specters are always foretells to something that is ephemeral and ethereal at the same time. Would you agree with me as a way of closing the session today?
Yes,
Episode today?
100%. 100%.
Okay.
Ephemeral, and I agree with you literally, not just in a poetical or metaphysical sense. The ghost
Uh-huh.
is ephemeral by its definition. A ghost evanesces, so it is not rooted
Yes.
in time, and whatever
Mm.
is not rooted in time, whatever is outside history, is ephemeral, and it is also ethereal because it is gaseous. It's a
Yes.
will o' the
Yes.
wisp. So I very much agree with you, and yes, it is epiphanic, deeply a spiritual process, and you're right in saying that there's a maybe a Ranjan Kundu hiding in all of us, which needs a little bit of growing up, and that is where literature comes in, Dr. Magan. That is where people like you and I come in. So we might be dinosaurs in our professional choices, but I think we are
Uh-huh.
still relevant, don't you think?
This has been a very numinous night. And I would say it's all because of you, because you're this great Indian railway guy who inducted the world to this the spectral nuances of time and space, all rolled into this very tiny first class compartment. Professor Chatterjee, I know that heading back to Haryana, you'd be taking the train once again. And would you be nostalgic?
What a pleasure, Dr. Magan. Indeed, I really enjoyed this conversation with you, and I'm told something happens to me when I start talking about ghosts. So maybe they
What?
speak through me, and I would be very happy to talk more on ghosts and how ghosts are really, more not as metaphysical and not as abstract as we think of them. They are immanent, they are omnipresent, they are all around us, and I think they deserve a lot of talking about, a lot of discursivizing. So, on that rather optimistic note, I very much hope that our viewers found our show helpful, informative, and somewhat memorable for their
Mm-hmm.
academic and other intellectual purposes. Dr. Magan, I think it is now the time for us to thank our viewers, and I hand it over to you.
Our dear viewers, I know that we have been telling you this very important mantra to listen very carefully, because only then can you like. And only then can you subscribe, because we don't force anyone. I mean, this is just so democratic a platform. If you thought that you learned something from this outside the four walls of your university, I mean, why not? You have to hit the button. And as I would always say to my students as well, please do comment. I mean, share your thoughts, and perhaps we can channel your energy into our next episode. We would be very happy to see how you engage with us. Professor Chatterjee, do you find that a very strategic way of encouraging our students or our viewers?
Absolutely. I think there's nothing like a non-sugar coated message. Viewers, we are very grateful to you, and we would very much want, rather, for you to like our podcast, to share it with your friends, to subscribe to our channel, and to please comment, because you all know it's no secret the algorithm gets helped by your comments. Even if you wish to, pretend to dislike us, even that is welcome under the circumstances, because as we have discussed in the Harari episode, the algorithms like people fighting, especially when algorithms fight with each other. So please stay with us, please stay tuned, and please help us produce interesting, innovative, intellectual content which can inspire intellectual activities in the universities and take the universities beyond to people in general,
Yes.
so that there is no division between the university wits and the laity any longer.
No Muslim chai and no Indic chai. There's just one chai, one tea, and I thought that we all love the tea, right? Okay, and as much as we love the chocolate and the other beverages offered to us
That's a
in the
wonderful
21st
message.
century.
I love that.
Okay, I'm a Cebuana. I would say maayong gabi natong tanan. Thank you. Daghang salamat. Professor Chatterjee, say it once again in your own language.
Namaste, everybody, and thank you so much. Bye bye. Ciao.